All right, I say we go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone. My name is Rachel Schwartz. I'm an assistant professor of international and area studies at the University of Oklahoma. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our second CAPC virtual conversation. Thanks so much for joining us. CAPC, the Central American Politics Consortium, is a new network we're seeking to establish among scholars from a variety of social science disciplines interested in contemporary political, social, and economic dynamics in the region. And it's being spearheaded by Tulane University's Center for Inter-American Policy and Research, CIPR, as well as the University of Oklahoma Center for the Americas. And I want to thank my colleague Ludovico Feoli at CIPR for helping put on this event. Today, we will be tackling what is no doubt among the most pressing concerns in Central America right now, state responses to gangs and criminal violence. And while I suspect we'll mostly be focusing on what's unfolding in El Salvador and to some extent Honduras, we'll also be discussing the broader hemispheric implications of current policies. And we are incredibly fortunate to have three leading experts to discuss these topics with us today. So before I introduce them, just a quick word on the format. So each of our panelists will provide about 8 minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll turn to a question and answer session. So please, if you have questions, enter them using the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Also, I do want to note that we are recording this event. So now let me provide a brief intro for each of our speakers. So first up, we will have Sonja Wolf, who is a researcher with the Drug Policy Program at CIDE in Mexico, where her work focuses on migration, security, gangs, and drug policy in Mexico and Central America. She is the author of Mano Dura, The Politics of Gang Control in El Salvador, which was published by the University of Texas Press in 2017, as well as many other articles. She's also the director of a recent documentary called The Vertical Border, which looks at how Central America's displaced navigate the immigration and asylum systems in Mexico and the United States. After Sonja, we'll have José Miguel Cruz, who is the Director of Research at the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University. And he was recently a fellow at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UC San Diego. He has published very extensively on criminal violence, gangs, police, democratization, and public opinion in Central America, and has recently been conducting work on the emergence and development of gangs like the MS-13 and Barrio 18 and how state security policies and informal actors shape these processes of gang development. And last but not least, we will have Michael Paarlberg, who is an assistant professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University. He's also an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on immigration, labor, as well as transnational gangs in Latin America. And he has also done a tremendous amount of sort of public-facing work, both media appearances, as well as writing for outlets like Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, Slate, and The Guardian, among others. So welcome to the three of you, and thank you again so much for joining us. I will hand the floor over to Sonja to get us started.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Thanks also for organizing this conversation. El Salvador has been living under the state of exception for a year now. So I thought I'd start by speaking a little bit about what the state of exception has been and what its consequences have been. So the state of exception was first decreed in March 2022 after a spike of homicides. About 90 people were killed in one weekend by gang members. So the state of exception has been extended several times since then. It is still in place, and during this time tens of thousands of people have been arrested. I think the figure has exceeded 65,000 now of alleged gang members. But it has also meant the suspension or the limitation of constitutional guarantees, such as the freedom of movement, also the freedom of association and due process rights. So ostensibly, this was done to control gang activity. Also, the authorities have very much focused on what we might call the symbolic aspects of the gang. So gang graffiti has been removed. The president also ordered the destruction of gang graves. But apart from these specific activities, what we see is also this construction of an enemy narrative and a shift that has taken place over time. Not just to speak about gang members, but of alleged terrorists. So when we see statistics being published by the authorities, there's this idea that everyone who has been arrested is not just involved in gangs, but is actually a terrorist. So the impact of all this, as I mentioned already, has been the very large number of arrests. Those numbers are striking, and also what seems to be a decline in registered homicides. But I would argue that this is a little bit more complicated. To what extent has violence in El Salvador actually decreased, and to what extent has the importance or the influence of the gangs also decreased since then. So we can also mention human rights violations. For example, arbitrary arrests, because many people who had nothing to do with the gangs have been arrested, and dozens of people have also died in detention due to the notoriously poor conditions in prisons. At the same time, we can note that there has been a lack of transparency. What is happening during the state of exception is largely communicated by the authorities. So the government has tried to show that the state of exception has been exceptionally successful in reducing gang violence, but actually much of what is happening, is not entirely clear. So what has been very striking is the images we have seen of arrests, but especially of gang members being transferred to the prisons, especially the newest prison that has been built, and that is now the largest detention facility in the region. So these images are very striking. We see gang members really rounded up heavily, tattooed gang members, which might perhaps make us wonder if these are individuals who were recently arrested, who were brought in from the communities, or if these were individuals who have already been in prison for a long time and who were perhaps gathered for these photo opportunities, because typically heavily tattooed gang members, well, are those who have already been in prison for quite some time. So the human rights violations have been documented insofar as that has been possible. They have been criticized by human rights defenders, but coming back a little bit to the figures, to the statistics that the authorities have been publishing, well, there may be doubts surrounding these figures, because we may ask, how have these figures actually been constructed? Who's been excluded or included in these statistics? So one aspect that has been mentioned is that the authorities are not counting alleged gang members who are being killed by state agents. So we know from the reporting that has been done, especially by El Faro, that there might be this sense now that the gangs are under control now, that despite the human rights violations that have been committed, the state of exception has been successful in a sense. I would say that this is also doubtful because of the ways in which the gangs have developed over time, and it is not feasible, I would say, to assume that the gangs can be wiped out in a very short time. Especially because what we have been seeing is really arrests of alleged gang members. But what has been missing in Bukele's strategy and also in previous years is really a greater focus on the social dimension of the gangs, on prevention, also on the reintegration of gang members, and so a strategy that focuses on the rest may be spectacular or may appear impactful in the short term. But I would like to emphasize that in the absence of greater attention to this social dimension, and of course also the continuity that is needed of security and justice reforms, it would be very difficult to actually have an impact on gang violence. And added to that, I would also like to mention that over the years, the gangs have been perhaps the most visible perpetrators of violence in El Salvador, but they have not been the only ones. So again, I would say this focus on the gangs, while it's important to address gang violence, the focus on the gangs as the main perpetrators of this violence seems misplaced. So why has this been happening? Bukele has claimed that he has been implementing a territorial control plan. So this is officially his strategy. But again, thanks to journalistic investigations, we know that Bukele has been negotiating with gangs for many years. He did this when he was mayor of San Salvador, and he's been doing this throughout his presidency, even though he has denied such pacts have taken place. And so the context for the static exception is the breakdown of one of these agreements, which generally were implemented in order to reduce gang violence, also for electoral brokerage, and generally to facilitate governments. So I think this is important to bear in mind. Again, despite the human rights violations, the apparent success of the state of exception has attracted attention by other countries. So we see Honduras, for example, that has apparently modeled its own state of exception on the state of exception in Honduras. What we can say about what the state of exception allows governments to do, looking particularly at El Salvador, I think this is an important case because presidential elections are coming up next year in El Salvador. So whether it's previous governments that also implemented a mano dura strategy, or whether it's Bukele at the moment, I think there's always this political electoral dimension to this strategy that emphasizes apparently short-term security gains over the need to invest in the long term in communities and also in security and justice institutions. So at the moment, what the state of exception has allowed Bukele to do is again create this illusion of security in the country, but also to continue to establish his particular way of governance that entails corruption, that also entails a lack of transparency, and that also allows him to build his profile as a president who is working on the modernization, on the development of El Salvador, and as a leader who has been able to give Salvadorans hope again that their country can also have less violence and can be a modern and developed country. So even though we're at the moment focusing on the state of exception and security, I would say that what Bukele is doing with this whole package goes beyond security in terms of how he can establish himself as a leader of a modern El Salvador.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonja, for those introductory remarks. I'm going to now pass the floor over to Miguel Cruz to share some thoughts with us as well.
Thank you, Rachel. I want to thank the University of Oklahoma and you, Rachel, and also Ludovico and Tulane University for the opportunity to share a little bit of our thoughts about situation of gangs and state response to gangs in Central America. And I'll try to be very brief. I'll basically focus on 3 points in response to a question that Rachel sent us or sent me, basically asking me to talk about what could be the response of gangs in this situation, especially around the state of exception in El Salvador. So I'm going to touch on 3 points. First, in order to be able to answer that question, I'll make a brief point about the context of gangs right before the state of exception. And second place, try to answer what is the response of gangs as we speak, which I have to say, I don't know. And third, what I can try to answer is what could be the response in the sort of medium and large term based on what we know from the past. So in order to make a very brief point about the context, let me share something that I've been working on based in recent years about the situation of gang. Can you see that my screen? Before the state of exception in El Salvador, and also these limited states of exceptions in Honduras. So what you're seeing is a map of the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, showing sort of the gang presence in each of the countries. And this is basically to tell you the difference between the presence of gangs in the 3 countries, which is very different, right? Usually we hear that, gangs control the Northern Triangle countries in the same way or the same problem, but it is not. It hasn't been the case. As you can see in El Salvador, the presence of gangs is by far more extensive than the other 2 countries. And then in second place, I would say Honduras, with important presence along the main metropolis in Honduras, and this sort of route here from the coast, to the main cities in Honduras, and in Guatemala, which is basically limited to the metropolitan area of Guatemala City and some places along the Pacific coast. Right, so the problem of gangs has been very different in the 3 countries, right? And then that explains in some way also the kind of responses that you have seen recently in the 3 countries. Is also in some way very different responses. The other thing I want to show you is sort of the organizational capabilities of these gangs in Central America, and again, they are very different. We like to talk about MS-13 being this transnational gang, like it seems to have sort of the same power across all countries, but it's not. It's very different in the way how they are organized from country to country. Right, and this is sort of the layout of organization in El Salvador of MS-13 and 18th Street Gang. And as you can see, and you will see very clearly when I show you the corresponding charts for Honduras and Guatemala, in El Salvador is by far, MS-13 has been by far the most organized and structured gang in comparison with the rest of the country. You can see, very different levels of organization, right? And coordination across almost every level. That's not the case. That hasn't been the case in Honduras. In Honduras, there is some kind of organization, but basically there is a simpler organization in Honduras for for many years, so that has been the case. In Guatemala, is even more simple, right? It's basically all revolves around cliques and some programs, right? And in 18th Street Gang in Guatemala, which is even larger in Guatemala than MS-13, right? You can see that basically it revolves around cliques, very individual cliques that have very little coordination other than at the very top. Why I'm showing you this? Because obviously the way states have been dealing with gangs is very different. The fact that in El Salvador had a truce in 2012, right, and that the Salvadorian government has been negotiating with gangs for some years now, on different administrations of the Salvadorian governments have been negotiating with gangs, have to do with the capabilities of gangs in El Salvador. They have more territorial presence, they are more organized, and then they are more able to broker some agreements with the central government and with different governments. So it is in this context. Actually, these graphs and this information basically comes right before the state of exception in El Salvador, to some extent in Honduras. So as Sonja already described, so the state of exception in El Salvador has seemingly changed a lot of things, right? Basically has put most of these gangs and most of the base and the rank and file of the gangs in prison. And the purpose of the Salvador government is basically put them all in a single huge prison, right? The famous by now largest prison in the world by Bukele's own account. So what does it mean for the response of gangs? And as I said before, I don't know. I really don't know, because we don't have too much data information what is going on within prisons where most of them are. Now, what I know, based on some research activity I'm conducting right now as we speak, evaluating a prevention program that has been in place in Central America for many years. What I do know is two things. First, that despite this effort and that despite that there seems to be, certainly a removal of most gang members or public expression of gang membership in the street. There's been an effective removal of that in an apparent sense of security. There are two things that are apparent that were apparent to me, at least from my last visit. First is that nobody's talking about gangs, even though you can see kids, you can see people who were associated or who are sympathetic to gangs is still present, right? And nobody's talking about gangs, because that has become sort of the new kind of bad word, right? So even if you try to, if you try to ask about the conditions that may lead to people to gangs or put youth at risk, nobody wants to talk about that, because even raising those kind or addressing these kind of things basically can call the attention of the police, and the police now can take you for just because of the way that you seem to be thinking, right? So that's an important result of the state of exception. And second, as I said, there is still some expressions, limited and muted expression of gangs. So when we consider this along with what I just showed you about, how all these youth or how organized these youth were, and now they are all in prison, the key question is what is happening in prison. And as I said before, we don't know exactly what is happening. What we do know from the past, from our research in the past, and we know it because there's enough evidence of that, is that similar efforts like the mano dura, like so famed mano dura in the 20 years ago, mano dura and super mano dura basically play an important role in the transformation of gangs from before. Why? Because obviously in prison they basically strengthen, they organize, and they expanded in prisons. What we're seeing now is what I'm calling a sort of mano dura on steroids, right? Basically, you're creating again a new conditions for a sort of realignment and re-strengthening of gangs that at some point we're going to see some of those results. How is that going to look like? That's what we don't know yet. But it's very difficult to think that something is not going to happen, thinking that you have 40,000, 50,000, and even if you don't have 40,000 as or 65, I'm sorry, 55,000, 65,000 in prison, it's very difficult to think that, with only 20,000 or 30,000 of people in a single jail, that won't generate a sort of social dynamic that at some point will blow up in Salvadorian society. So with this, I'll stop. I wanted to talk a little bit about Honduras, but I ran out of time. But we'll leave that for the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Miguel. And I will now hand things over to Michael to sort of wrap up our introductory comments, and we'll then turn to the Q&A. Please, folks, submit any questions you have using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel, for putting together this great panel and for the whole series of webinars that you've put together. They've been great. I'll be I think I'm probably largely in agreement with Sonja and Miguel, but I want to emphasize my skepticism about this strategy as a viable long-term solution to the gang issue. This is, as Miguel mentioned, it is mano dura, just on a larger scale, but effectively the same policy of iron fist policing. And mano dura is always popular in the moment that it is implemented, because it demonstrates the government's security commitment in a very dramatic fashion through these public displays of force, which are very much played for media consumption. And there has been no government, no president in Salvadoran history that has been more media savvy, social media savvy than the current one. President Bukele tweets a lot. He tweets a lot in English. He knows who his audience is when he is doing this. He knows what he is doing when he parades, as Sonja alluded to, scary looking gang members with face tattoos. This is a look that has not actually been seen on the street in El Salvador for over 10 years. When I was doing field work in San Miguel, which is an area of MS-13, heavy MS-13 presence, you didn't see. You knew that the gangs were there. They were largely in control, had infiltrated the police and local government, but you didn't see the people with the scary giant 13 MSs on their faces. So this is a familiar and scary trope that has been played up in pop culture, movies like Sin Nombre, and something that is familiar to the foreign press, and also very importantly familiar to the diaspora, which who left for largely the United States a while ago. So it is definitely a play for foreign, especially diaspora support. But it is not actually represented the people who are currently being swept up in these gang sweeps. And we know that a number of them are not actually gang members. We know that the police have a quota, that they're being incentivized with extra vacation days for more people that they are arresting. And with the estimate out that Salvadoran has said, over 100,000 people, their estimate to be in gangs. This essentially means that any young man in a poor neighborhood is arrestable. And we're hearing anecdotally more people who are in support of the state of exception, of the anti-gang measures, having a brother, having an uncle, having a cousin who has been picked up by the police who they know are not gang members. So I'm wondering how sustainable this popularity is as the numbers go up and more people who are arrested arbitrarily and held without any rights are increasingly known by the population to not be gang members. That said, it's this is not a long-term solution because the gangs adapt. First of all, it always has a displacing effect, right? So at first, the gangs moved from the cities to the country. They relocated to the prisons where they, have exerted historically hegemonic control. Now it's moving from El Salvador to Guatemala, Honduras, and southern Mexico, which I guess from the perspective of the Salvadoran government is no longer a problem for them. But the gangs have not disappeared. They're simply adapting. And with every round of government negotiations with the gangs, which has taken place under every administration, not just the Bukele administration, very famously with the truce brokered by the Funes government, the gangs have become more sophisticated in their negotiations. In the past, when they have exacted concessions from the government, these have been very specific and kind of self-interested concessions for the gang leadership, the imprisoned Ranfla, it's like things like PlayStations in prison. And then as we've seen in the current rounds of negotiations, the Salvadoran government is currently and still to this day protecting gang leaders from extradition requests from the United States, from the DEA. And so this shows that the gangs are becoming more sophisticated in their demands. And so my prediction is they're going to come out of this in a different form. Maybe they will be different gangs. Maybe they'll have a different name. Maybe they'll be more fractured, but they will have learned from this experience and become in some way a more sophisticated organized crime network. Now, it's important to note, as Sonja did, that the gangs are not simply a criminal organization, they are a social phenomenon. They rise out of these structural conditions: poverty, social immobility, corruption, as well as histories of U.S. policy intervention and U.S. deportation policies, which is why you can't purely arrest your way out of this problem. And this is why the central reason why I'm skeptical about the government's approach, because for all of the arrests, I am wondering, where are all of the social responses to this? First of all, what are they going to do with all the people arrested? Are you going to keep 65,000 people in jail forever? Presumably not. And once again, the jails, the prison system is where the gangs have consolidated their control historically. But presumably, when people get out, whether they are gang members or not, will the government be providing jobs? Will there be training programs? Will there be gang exit programs, which actually the government has never really been able to do effectively? The only effective gang exit programs are run by the churches. Will there be counseling? Will there be business development to give young men in poor neighborhoods a means to earn outside of crime? And then there's the other question of who they're arresting, right? It's all low-level gang members. But what about corrupt officials? In many places, such as San Miguel, it's well known that the gangs have infiltrated local government. There's the phenomenon of the so-called narco mayors, like Mayor Salgado, and throughout the country. This corruption reaches the highest levels of the Bukele government. The current fiscal, the attorney general, the Minister of Security, they have connections to gangs as effectively gang lawyers, connections to large money laundering networks like the Texas cartel. This goes into diplomacy. The consul general of the Salvadoran consulate in Long Island is admitted former, in his words, former member of MS-13. Is the government arresting all of them? No, the government is arresting low-level alleged gang members and effectively poor young men. But in the meantime, they're continuing to protect top-level gang leaders from extradition, going so far as to escort one of them out of the country to Guatemala to avoid extradition, and still working on these types of secret pacts behind the scenes. So what does this mean long term? What does this mean for public trust for institutions like the police or like the justice system, which already has very low levels of public trust? What will it mean for the role of the military, which has taken on policing roles? And how long will that last? Ultimately, a military occupation, which is what this is in the neighborhoods in which the military is deployed, it has to end sometime. And when that does end, will the temporary peace that comes with it, will that end? Unless the state of exception becomes permanent. And we've seen with the multiple renewals of it, which presumably will continue at least through President Bukele's inevitable reelection, it will become a permanent state. And what does that mean? We've seen some of the press coverage, the breathless press coverage of this describe this as a miracle. This was the words of the Colombian magazine Semana. Is this really a miracle? We don't, just as an example, you don't really see a problem with organized crime in Cuba, right? Why? Because we understand Cuba to be a police state, right? Which keeps 1% of its population in jail. Well, El Salvador currently has 2% of its adult population in jail. So, as long as El Salvador is an effectively one-party police state, we probably will see the effective suppression of organized crime at the street level, but then the incorporation of it within higher levels of government, the absorption of organized crime and the cooperation of it at the higher levels with the current government. We're seeing this with the prison system, with the director of prisons who's been named, has been sanctioned under GLOMAG sanctions and named the Angle list as enlisting the gangs in embezzlement schemes of COVID relief funds. So I think that once again, the gangs are adapting, but they're also being co-opted. And what we'll see in the end will be something which I've written for Global Americans as effectively a gang state, one in which the gangs themselves are not necessarily visible on the streets, but have been incorporated into the state apparatus.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. So we have received a number of questions in the Q&A panel. So I'm going to try and bring some of them together on similar themes. And the first one I want to ask will hopefully give Miguel an opportunity to talk a little bit about Honduras, because I want to zoom out here and think a little bit more broadly in a hemispheric sense. So we've seen sort of an attempt at implementing a similar policy under the Castro regime in Honduras. But I think there's some question about whether sort of that has looked the same, whether in an operational sense, as somebody mentioned in the chat, that could actually sort of the Honduran government could actually achieve something along the lines of what El Salvador has done, if you call it an achievement, right? And so I'm wondering about that in the Honduran case, but also I'm curious, we've heard reports about, for example, Zuri Rios in Guatemala, the sort of presidential frontrunner, hiring Bukele's advisors to her campaign team and sort of can we imagine a sort of broader diffusion beyond Central America or beyond sort of Honduras and El Salvador, at least, of these kinds of policies, given how politically popular and given their sort of perceived success? And I don't know, Miguel, if you want to sort of take that first to be able to talk a little bit about Honduras, and then we can kind of open it up to others as well.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Very quickly, I think one of the points that has to be made clear about the Salvadorian case is that what we focus usually about the strategy of Salvador is this, is obviously the state of reception. But actually, the Salvadorian strategy is the state of reception is only a part of a broader strategy that entails negotiating with the leaders of the gangs. Right. So what you have in El Salvador, because of the structure of gangs in El Salvador, you have the Salvadoran government negotiating with the leaders and providing some sort of benefits to leaders, like, the ones that Michael already described, like getting some of them out of prisons, even taking them to Mexico, providing some kind of, not public benefits, while at the same time you go again, with this kind of full force mano dura against sort of the rank and file of the rest of the gang, right? So that makes that on one hand you basically demobilize the leaders, or you put the leaders somehow on your side, while at the same time basically you remove most of those who do the violence on the streets and put them on prison. So that's part of the strategy first. Why is not possible that in Honduras in the same way? First, because the Honduran gangs don't have the same kind of reach that they have in El Salvador. So the Honduran government first don't doesn't have a sort of single interlocutor in the world, or sort of a small group of interlocutors in the way that the Salvadorians have. So they have many other different actors, right, and more fragmented. First, second, because the role of gangs is very strong in some communities, urban communities in Honduras, right? I mean, even if you control those, that the effect won't be that perceptible in the way that the Salvadorian is. So, and as I think David mentioned in the chat, is the Honduran basically response is more performative. I have to say that the Salvadorian too is very performative too, but the Honduran is very performative in the sense of trying to say, oh, look, we're doing the same as the Salvadorian, so you guys have, we also do this kind of thing, so we should be popular too. So I think most of the discussion, at least internationally, has focused on the, on the hard part of the state of exception, because that's the one that is being propelled by the Salvadorian propaganda, right? But remember, it's part of a larger strategy in which you have been negotiating with the leaders, and you have basically neutralized the leaders not by using force, by using carrots. So yeah, that's the other thing that you have to take into account.
Let me just add to that very briefly. I don't think Castro government is going to be as effective either in terms of the optics or the benchmarks, simply because President Castro does not exercise the kind of hegemonic control that President Miguel does in El Salvador. President Miguel does not have to deal with an opposition. There effectively is no opposition to him, and the Legislative Assembly answers to him. President Castro has to answer to, still a quite powerful opposition, and the National Party is itself quite closely tied to many elements of organized crime, and so there are contradictions within the political system in Honduras, which President Bukele does not have to contend with.
Great, Sonja, do you have anything to add?
Not on this point specifically. Sorry, there were questions about militarization and the prison conditions. So I think I'd like to come back to those points later on.
Okay, great. So one other question that I think, Sonja, you might be able to answer that popped up in the chat that I think is particularly important is thinking about what is happening right now to deportees that are being sent back to places like El Salvador in these kinds of conditions. Can any of you sort of comment on that question, or even sort of more broadly, the relationship between the state of exception and migration? Sort of how is that unfolding? What have been the consequences?
I think I would just like to make reference to the displacement that has been happening in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras also. But what we have seen in the case of El Salvador specifically for some time was that much of the displacement occurred because of the gang violence. So one of the implications of the state of exception, and in a way it relates to what Miguel said earlier, because of the particular kind of state intervention that is happening at the moment. People may be afraid to talk about gangs, but because of the ease that state agents have at the moment to arrest virtually anyone who might be suspected of having ties to gangs, these migration dynamics might be changing. So it doesn't look like migration from El Salvador is going to decrease, but the reasons for this displacement may be changing. And so instead of gangs expelling people, it may be this fear of the state that might drive people more out of El Salvador, as was previously the case. But one concern I also have relates to the asylum applications. So while we know that not everyone who leaves El Salvador will necessarily apply for asylum in Mexico or the United States. Asylum has been an important survival strategy for many people, and we know that there are still many asylum cases pending in the United States. So my concern would be, if it now seems that the Bukele government is having some success in reducing gang violence, what will this mean for the asylum cases that are still pending? Does this mean that people are going to lose these cases and will be returned to El Salvador, even though there is reason to think that the conditions actually are not really improving in El Salvador?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if either of you, Michael, Miguel, I know, Michael, you've done a lot of work on immigration as well. If you have any other thoughts on this question.
Yeah, sure. I serve as an expert witness in U.S. immigration courts as a country condition expert, just informing the court about conditions. And I'm aware that that on the U.S. government side, there has been an interest in particularly Alfaro's reporting about the gangs becoming immobilized. I will say that. And I think Carlos Dada of Alfaro has expressed nuance to this as well. It doesn't mean the gangs don't exist anymore. It means they are adapting. It means they are, in some ways, laying low. It does mean that their streams of revenue have become interrupted, which is primarily extortion, right, protection rackets. But it doesn't mean that the gang members don't exist anymore. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that people will not, who the gang seeks for having wronged them in some way or cooperative police, could not become targets in the future once the gangs, I guess, get out from under the state of exception. So it's not to say that the danger to deportees, doesn't exist. It's just things are in flux at the moment, and I think we're all waiting to see how exactly the gangs adapt.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about a little bit about this question of militarization that has kind of popped up in a couple of questions. So there's sort of one question comment about sort of the association of fighting gangs with essentially irregular warfare. And this policy being something that has sort of been emanating from U.S. military circles, but also sort of on the domestic side of things, the popularity of using the military to tackle some of these issues. How do you all sort of respond to the question of remilitarization in the region? And is this actually a sort of remilitarization, or is this part of a sort of broader continuity that we've seen in terms of security policies?
I can go first if you want. So this idea of the militarization and this doctrine from some circles in the military, of responding to gangs in military ways, or the use in the military, is not new. Actually, it's been around for some decades now, and the first sort of elaborations of that came about the late 1990s, actually, where there was this conceptualization of gangs, of a sort of third level gangs as a new kind of urban warriors, right? So this is not new, and in different stages, some of that, some of those ideas have been used to justify, mano dura, the zero tolerance, and recurrently, different types of response to gangs. The problem with these responses, basically, they ignore that gangs are essentially a social domestic problem, right? Even if you accept, some nature of transnationality of gangs. I mean, the gangs in El Salvador, and I will say this, I've been sustaining this in different fora. I mean, the essential problem of Central American gangs doesn't have to do essentially with migration. It has to do essentially with the local condition in each of the countries. So we have this kind of gangs in Central America, not that much because of the migration thing, but because of the way these countries have been responding to the social problems that have been some kind of boiling in Central America for decades now. So to the extent that we keep ignoring those problems, those social problems, right, and we continue responding to those problems with the use of force or with the military as the only way, or not even the only way, but perhaps the privileged way to respond to those things, we'll continue having these issues, because at the end, it's a matter of young kids who join groups looking for responses to answer to responses to the questions about autonomy, identity, belonging, which the only way they find in many of these places is through joining gangs, right? Because there are no other options, right? And for years there's been sort of this effort to create these other options, but over and over, time and time again, they are basically crushed by the new iteration of militarization and using force, using the military to crush the whatever expression of gun you have at that moment, which only basically complicates the issues and make it even bigger for the future.
I'd like to just add to that, that as Miguel points out, it's not unique, it's not new within El Salvador. It's also not unique to El Salvador. The role of the military going beyond its military function into a policing function is something that is being adopted by many countries in the region and has been for a long time. Successive administrations in Mexico, for example, have turned to the military to take on policing roles. Why? Because throughout Latin America, the military is more trusted than the police. Police generally have very low levels of public trust. In El Salvador, one survey showed as over 80% of Salvadoran citizens believe the PNC, the National Civic Police, to be corrupt. And so, of course, it makes sense from a PR perspective to put the military in those positions. Militaries consistently throughout Latin America have the highest rates of public trust, much higher than any other institution, including often elected officials. But this is not necessarily a good solution. First of all, soldiers are not trained to be police. They're not trained to make arrests. They're not trained to investigate crimes. They're trained to engage, right? To treat the people they are policing as enemy combatants. And so this is something that again is not a long-term function for the question of citizen security or a long-term solution to that problem. And the other problem is, the reason why police have such low levels of public trust is because they have been corrupted, in many cases infiltrated. I've come across anecdotal cases of people being extorted by police officers in El Salvador who show their MS-13 tattoos to their targets. As militaries take over police functions, not just in El Salvador, other countries, they will be put in similar situations in which they could be corrupted as well. Previous administrations of El Salvador have released figures of both police cadets and military cadets having been found to have gang ties. And the gangs have been, in the past, deliberately tried to infiltrate security forces. And so this is the kind of thing that, again, it's not a long-term solution. If the military simply take over police functions, they will become as compromised as the police eventually in the long term.
Thank you. Sonja, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, perhaps if I could just add something on narratives. When we think about should the armed forces intervene against the gangs, but also the popularity of the armed forces. I think when we speak about the so-called gang threat, how serious is gang activity, we need to bear in mind who constructs these narratives about gangs. So it's MS-13, for example, that has been a lot in the news in El Salvador, also in the United States. So the idea of the gangs being some sort of insurgency, again, this is also not new. We hear this periodically, but I think that there seems to be an interest not just on the part of politicians, but also the law enforcement community and military analysts who are creating a particular kind of image of what these gangs mean and how they should be tackled. And so the armed forces also, I would say, because of the idea of the armed forces as being particularly disciplined, there's often this idea that corruption is a problem in the police, but not in the armed forces. But this is not true. The armed forces are not necessarily synonymous with a lack of corruption. They're simply more hermetic, more closed institution, and it's more difficult for citizens to understand what is happening within the armed forces. But I think these narratives that police institutions are corrupt and that the armed forces should intervene, whether it's in El Salvador or as Michael mentioned in Mexico or other countries, it relies on a particular idea of the armed forces as the ones who can get us out of this violence. Whereas at the same time, this negative image of police institutions persists when it does not need to be the case. That the police are not necessarily inefficient or corrupt, but the problem is that the security reforms that have been pending for a long time are being postponed, and again because of this ongoing narrative that police forces are not reliable and that the armed forces should step in. But this supposedly temporary stepping in of the armed forces has become permanent. So there's just no space for police reform. And so I think we do have to recognize that gang violence can be very serious. I think all of the panelists here know from our research that this is the case, and I wouldn't want to minimize gang violence or the impact that the gang presence has in marginal communities. But I think if societies really want to be serious about tackling violence overall, not just gang violence, we really need to step from these short-term symbolic responses that make people think that the governments are being decisive, that they're acting against violence, when this is not what they're doing. So I'm afraid to say that there are no short-term responses. I know that many people ask for this or hope for this, but we need to think in the medium and long term and build safer communities and more effective institutions that can actually respond to this challenge of violence in a sustainable manner.
Great. Thank you so much. That takes us to 12:59. So I think we will wrap up here. I apologize. I did not get to all of the excellent questions in the chat. But I want to thank everyone for their participation. I especially want to thank our three experts for sharing their thoughts with us today. Please be on the lookout for information on our next CAPC virtual conversation, which will be happening towards the end of April. We'll be discussing some emerging research on migration and deportation in the region. And so please look forward to that. Thank you again to our panelists. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day and weekend. Thank you.